Good evening there, everybody. What is happening? Hopefully, y'all are having a wonderful day today. So, when it comes down to it, I thought that I would talk about this particularly interesting conversation, at least a conversation that I kind of wanted to have over this, because Mr. Canelo Alvarez, of course, he is now back in boxing, or he is now back in the winning totem pole. When it comes down to it, of course, he was able to completely outbox Gennady Triple G Golovkin in that trilogy fight. Of course, there was a certain amount of people that were underwhelmed by that fight because they did not believe that it was an entertaining fight. But for pretty much any of us that knew overall anything about boxing, or for those of us that have been watching it, hardcore, we knew that more than likely that this was going to be the quote unquote most boring one out of the trilogy just because Gennady Golovkin clearly was not the same fighter as what he once was. Not only that, but Canelo Alvarez was coming off of a, in my view, somewhat dominant loss to Mr. Dimitri Bivol. So I did not expect Canelo Alvarez to go for the knockout quite as much as what he was letting on. And of course, there was a certain amount of people that alleged that they were not impressed by Canelo Alvarez's performance, mainly those, videos that I usually tend to review, aka the LDBC and new media, the main ones that of course do not like Canelo Alvarez. So it just is what it is. But there was a couple of other people that stated that they were not impressed. Certain guys like Oscar De La Hoya, Roberto Duran, and a few others. And listen, they're all entitled to their opinion. Now, besides that of Roberto Duran, when we talk about Oscar De La Hoya and a couple of those other guys, do I believe that maybe they have overall some, dirty business when it comes down to it? Or what I mean by that, do I think that they maybe have an axe to grind with Canelo Alvarez like that about Oscar De La Hoya or Juan Manuel Marquez? Yes, I do. It just is what it is. But anyways, Mr. Dante's Boxing Nation, he's going to be talking about that in this video. And mainly what this video is going to be about is who Mr. Canelo Alvarez should fight next. Now, apparently from what I hear, he might very well have a hand injury, which I do believe is very possible, but we'll see what happens. At least a slightly torn ligament when it comes on it from what I've heard, or a torn ligament in his left hand. Whether it is 100% true or not, or whether it's true at all, who knows? I don't know, but if I had to guess, I don't think that Canelo really has a reason to lie about it. Once again, I thought that he looked very good in the Gennady Golovkin fight, so I don't really see overall why he would lie about it, but we'll see overall what ends up happening. But in my view, Mr. Canelo Alvarez, more than likely, there's going to be three very likely opponents for him within his next fight. Now, we all think that more than likely he probably is going to face Mr. Dimitri Bivol in his next fight. David Benavidez, of course, is one that a lot of people have asked for, which I certainly do understand why. He, is a fan-friendly fighter with an action-packed style, and the both of them are somewhat of Mexican descent. David Benavidez, I believe, is half Mexican and half Ecuadorian, so that would be a very interesting fight. And then you also have Mr. Jamal Charlo. I think that any one of those fights would be very particularly interesting, and I'm going to talk about all of them in this video, and I'm also going to explain which one, in my view, probably would be the best, or at least which one I would want to see. But anyways, we're going to talk about that here in the video. Let's get it started.
Dante's Boxing Nation, what's going on, guys? Man, oh man, when I tell you guys the walls are closing in, they are really closing in from every direction, from Canelo's peers.
These guys have been saying that about Canelo Alvarez for the past 17 years. I swear to God, they've been saying this for the past several years with Mr. Canelo Alvarez. If the walls were truly closing in on Canelo to the degree that they were, like, once again, these guys try to act like Canelo Alvarez is some Mikey Garcia or Gervonta Tank Davis or some shit. I mean, they try to act like this dude has literally fought like no A-grade fighters. Canelo has fought fighters like Lara. He's fought fighters like Jacobs and Gennady Golovkin and Caleb Plant and Billy Joe Saunders and Callum Smith. Even if you want to mention these guys, and I don't usually mention them because, in my view, either A, they were not A-grade fighters, or they were a little bit out of weight. Maybe someone like that of an Amir Khan, maybe a James Kirkland if you were going to mention him. But in my view, James Kirkland was never that great of a fighter. Canelo has almost fought everybody that he is needed to. Now, are there certain fights that I would have liked to have seen or that other people would have liked to have seen that have not happened yet? Yeah, sure. I would like to see the Jamal Charlo fight just as much as everybody else. I would like to see the David Benavidez fight just as much as everybody else. But overall, I never really got after Canelo Alvarez too much because what Canelo Alvarez has always shown me is that he's usually willing to get in the ring with the best of the best. And I can't really overall get on him too hard because the previous fight before this was against a light heavyweight champion who I always thought was an A grade fighter, probably an A plus fighter, in Mr. Dimitri Bivol. So Canelo has always shown me that usually the challenges that he takes within his career are usually very consistently tough. So I don't usually get after Canelo Alvarez that much. However, what I will state is this: if the Dimitri Bivol rematch does not happen, in my view, his next fight is going to have to be either against Jamal Charlo or David Benavidez. At least maybe. He may be able to get away with maybe facing a John Ryder if he states, well, Dimitri Bivol might be busy right now. Let's just say for, this sake that, Dimitri Bivol and Zurdo Ramirez have a rematch or something like that. Or maybe Canelo was out for a while and, he wants to get the hand surgery or something like that. But when it comes down to it, all in all, after that or within these next two fights, if the Dimitri Bivol fight does not happen, he is going to have to face either David Benavidez or Jamal Charlo. The fight that I would actually want to see the most out of all those fights, in my personal opinion, is actually Mr. Jamal Charlo. And a lot of people would state, well, why overall would you want to see Mr. Jamal Charlo? Having you said yourself that in your opinion, that Jamal Charlo probably does not have the greatest chance against Canelo Alvarez. That is correct. I don't think that Jamal Charlo, at least in my view, has really any more than a 25 to 30% chance over Canelo Alvarez. At least a Canelo Alvarez that clearly is in decent shape and is someone overall who looks like his regular, technically sound self. But I think that the fight is very particularly interesting. And the reason why I say that is because even though I don't think Jamal Charlo is as skilled as Canelo Alvarez, I think that it is a very big event. I think that event could potentially do 1 million pay-per-view buys, or at least around there. Both the Charlo brothers are very well known within the boxing world when it comes down to it. And it's been a fight that a lot of people have been asking for many, many years. I think that, to be honest with you, it may actually bring more benefits to Canelo Alvarez to face Jamal Charlo right now. But I think that Canelo Alvarez, at least when it comes to Jamal Charlo, excuse me, and maybe also David Benavidez as well, I believe that what Canelo wants, at least in my view, and I believe that more than likely this is what is going to happen. I believe that more than likely he is probably going to face Dimitri Bivol next. That's if Dimitri Bivol can get past Mr. Zurdo Ramirez. So that's going to be a very interesting fight as well. But anyways, Mr. Dante is going to continue talking. Let's get into it.
To even old media asking Canelo Alvarez real questions that journalists usually ask in other sports like football, basketball, baseball. Real questions that fans really want answers to. For the first time, Canelo is getting it from every single direction. Due to his lackluster performance against a 40-year-old Gennady Golovkin that actually looked 40 years old in every way. So Roberto...
Allegedly, this was a lackluster performance by Canelo Alvarez because he did not get the knockout. I already told people heading into this fight that Dante and Ego and a certain amount of these other channels that I tend to review, they were not going to be happy no matter what Canelo Alvarez did in this fight. Even Mr. Ego stated all in all that, well, if Canelo knocks him out very early on, it's going to look really bad, which I understood overall where he was coming from. But if it's controversial, then it looks bad as well. So once again, these guys were always going to try to set it up from the angle of Canelo Alvarez could do no right in this fight. And listen, Gennady Golovkin very clearly was not the same fighter that he once was. But Canelo Alvarez did what he was supposed to do. It just is what it is. I did not hear Dante's Boxing Nation bitch, moan, and complain about how Devin Haney, in my view, really did not have the best performance over Jorge Linares when it came down to it. Or I shouldn't say that he didn't have the best performance, but he did not knock out Jorge Linares, and he even got hurt in that fight. He got shaky in that fight because overall he did not take him seriously in the final parts of the fight, and he got hit with a good right. And that was a Jorge Linares that was even at a worse position in his career than what Gennady Golovkin was in his. Because at least Gennady Golovkin was, a middleweight champion. So it is what it is. But you don't hear it overall with those fighters. And listen, I get it. When it comes to Mr. Dante, he sees a lot of black fighters that more than likely overall do receive criticism from a certain amount of other fans. And I get it. So from his perspective, it's like, well, why overall are people not calling Canelo Alvarez boring? Why are people overall not doing this to Canelo Alvarez? And that's, understandable. But in my view, there's a better way to bring up that point. But that's also why Dante's Boxing Nation cannot really be trusted as an objective and logical observer because he's not really one of those guys. He's not a logical and objective observer. He never has been. He's always been a guy, all in all, that has been very deep into his emotions and basically states, well, if you're not going to give my fighters credit, I'm not going to give your fighters credit, and I'm above that. It just is what it is. I'm not a person that, all in all, goes by that bullshit. Listen, at the end of the day, are there going to be a certain amount of pro-racial fans and pro-racial media? Yes, there is. But if you're going to call yourself a logical and objective commentator or someone that allegedly speaks nothing but the truth and all the time the whole truth, you overall have to be somewhat fair, logical, and consistent. And Dante is not that. I'm just sorry. It is what it is.
Duran was asked to give his take on the Canelo Alvarez performance against Gennady Golovkin. And this is what he said.
No lo vi nada. ¿No? No vi nada. Vi Canelo lo vi intenso, Pillín fuera de distancia, no puso presión, no hizo nada. No hizo nada.
¿Qué es la próxima pelea por Canelo?
Yo creo que él debe pelear con el que le ganó.
¿O el Bivol? ¿El revancha?
All right, guys, so just in case you didn't read the transcript, the translation that I had on the screen while Duran was talking, this is what he said. He said, Canelo, I didn't see anything. I saw him tense, out of distance. He didn't put any pressure. He didn't do anything. I think he should fight the one who beat him. And when he said that, obviously he was talking about this.
Well, I do agree that Mr. Canelo Alvarez should fight the one that beat him eventually, Mr. Dimitri Bivol. Mr. Dimitri Bivol, of course, was able to beat Canelo in that fight 8 rounds to 4. Let me state this. In my view, was Canelo Alvarez in the best of shape in that fight? No, he clearly wasn't. But even if Canelo Alvarez does show up in the best shape possible, even if he does become the best version of himself that he could be, there still is no guarantee that Canelo Alvarez is going to win that fight. Now, maybe had he won the first fight, even had it been 7 rounds to 5, or certain people thought that it could have went either way, then maybe the rematch could have went differently. But the fact that Canelo Alvarez is going to go in here, and the fact that Mr. Dimitri Bivol is going to go in here, that more than likely, all in all, that he said, listen, not only, was I able to beat you when it came down to it, or not only was I able to get in certain shots against you, I am the second fighter of your career that was able to get an official win over you on paper. Because yes, Gennady Golovkin, when it came down to it, if we really want to go there, more than likely he deserved the second win over Mr. Canelo Alvarez in that first fight. But it was scored as a draw. And sometimes when it comes to those fights, depending on what the first fight is, even if it is a robbery, that can somewhat get into the fighter's mind. So that is going to be very particularly interesting to see if Canelo does rematch Mr. Dimitri Bivol, which I believe more than likely that he will, how he's going to be able to handle that.
This man right here, Dimitri Bivol. Guys, it's pretty much unanimous across the board. Everyone who is doing interviews, everyone who's giving their thoughts on this fight, they're pretty much saying the exact same things about Canelo's performance. Duran just pretty much corroborated everything I said in my post-fight video and more. But forget about just this fight. Everything you guys have heard me say about Canelo.
Well, I think Mr. Roberto Duran, sometimes he can be a little bit of an extremist because I think that he holds himself to a very high standard. And I don't necessarily disagree with everything that he stated, but I think all in all to say that Canelo Alvarez didn't do anything in this fight, I think that that's going a little bit too far. And I don't want to overall bring in anything personal in on this, but if you want to talk about a fighter that didn't do shit overall in a rematch when it came down to it, let's talk about Roberto Duran and that Sugar Ray Leonard rematch. You want to talk about someone that didn't live up to expectations. But anyways, when it comes down, I'm not really going to bring that up, at least that much. But I understand where Mr. Roberto Duran was coming from, but I thought that it was a very good performance, once again, considering the standards overall where Mr. Canelo Alvarez was coming from. We can't take a look at every fight the same. Overall, when it comes down to, just like if we were to take a look at Deontay Wilder in his next fight against Robert Elenius. Now, in that fight, he may not possibly look that great, but what Deontay Wilder's objective has to be is just to win the fight. And the reason why that is going to be a tough fight, at least potentially for him, is because Deontay Wilder is facing a guy that is experienced against him in sparring. He's facing a guy that is coming off of a very decent win, I believe, over a Polish heavyweight fighter who was formerly undefeated, and he was able to stop him, I believe, twice. And on top of that, he's very decently lengthy and he's big and he's got a little pop in his punch. So once again, we have to know, all in all, well, this fighter might have a little bit of a problem with this fighter because not only are they experienced against each other, but we also have to take a look and see where that fighter is in their career. And I still think that Canelo is at the peak of his career, but I think all in all that more than likely that there was a little bit of pressure on him, especially to win this fight because of his last loss against Dimitri Bivol. So I didn't really think overall that the performance was bad. I just would not say that it was the best performance that I've ever seen from Canelo. He probably could have done a little bit more in the fight, especially to get the stoppage, but I really don't think that it was that big of a deal considering the circumstances.
Alvarez has been proven right, and it has consistently come to fruition. So mark my words when I tell you guys this.
Everything you've stated overall about Canelo Alvarez has allegedly come to fruition. What specifically, Dante? Because you've been talking a lot of shit about Canelo Alvarez for the past several years, and you have backtracked on a lot of the stuff that you have stated. Anyway, and when I say backtracked, I'm talking about allegedly how he believes that Canelo is going to lose to this fighter and this fighter and this fighter. But then as soon as that fight gets set up, all of a sudden that fighter's a bum. All of a sudden that fighter, is not the same anymore. All of a sudden, no, that fighter already has a loss on this record. So come on, Dante. Let's be real.
Get much worse for Canelo Alvarez. It's all downhill from here on for Canelo Alvarez, guys. I mean, you just heard Roberto Duran. He said Canelo Alvarez, he needs to fight that guy that beat him, Dimitri Bivol. DAZN was even asking Canelo Alvarez questions about fighting Bivol next. You guys already know I made plenty of videos telling you that there's no way Canelo Alvarez is beating Bivol before he lost to Bivol. So when it comes...
Well, you stated that in one of your videos, and this is the same exact thing that Mr. Boxing Eagle will do. Mr. Boxing Eagle and Dante's Boxing Nation, they will tell you several different things that could happen. But you notice that when that fight was starting to finally come to fruition, Dante was going on his regular narrative of, oh, well, Bivol's another European-style fighter. So that's actually the point that he was trying to make. Those were the points that he actually was making. There was only at one point in time where he stated that Mr. Dimitri Bivol would for sure beat Canelo Alvarez. So actually, no, Dante, you were not consistent in your fight prediction.
For a rematch, he really has no chance in a rematch. If Golovkin gets more aggressive, that means he gets more tired, and he might end up even getting knocked out or knocked down in that fight if he tries to get more aggressive, because he's most likely going to become more reckless, leaving himself open for more.
Did he say that Canelo Alvarez wouldn't have a chance against Gennady Golovkin in a rematch? Maybe he was talking about Dimitri Bivol. I don't know what the hell he's stating. Listen, overall, what I will say is this. If Canelo Alvarez is going to rematch Mr. Dimitri Bivol, he's going to have to put on the best performance of his career. Because if you were even to ask me who do I believe would win that rematch, at the current moment in time, I would have to go with Mr. Dimitri Bivol. And it's not necessarily that I believe that he's just beating Canelo Alvarez in every category, but you must understand, Canelo Alvarez is pretty much a natural middleweight, at least in terms of his height and reach. It was always going to be a very difficult fight for Canelo in the first place. And on top of that, he did lose the first fight, in my view, 8 rounds to 4. So whether Canelo Alvarez does make adjustments or not, it is still going to be not only overall a physical, hurdle that he has to get over, but a mental hurdle as well. Not saying that it's impossible. If there's a fighter out there that can beat overall a fighter that is somewhat decently bigger than them, like a Dimitri Bivol is against Canelo Alvarez, and overall as highly skilled as what he is, Canelo is one of the few fighters that can do it. But at the end of the day, he is going to have to put on the performance of a lifetime. His defense is going to have to be absolutely astounding. And I actually don't think that his defense was bad in the first 4 rounds. In fact, he was blocking most of Dimitri Bivol's shots. But his stamina has to be on par. It has to be on par. His stamina probably has to be the best that it ever has been. Now the power, in my opinion, that's kind of where it got Canelo Alvarez in trouble the last time. In my view, he gained way too much weight for that fight. Now, maybe he thinks that he can gain a little bit of weight against Dimitri Bivol, and maybe overall that will win him the fight. Who knows? It could, but in my opinion, Canelo Alvarez, he's probably going to want to stay around the same weight of whatever he was at the 168-pound division. Because Canelo has always had a little bit of stamina issues. He's not going to be able to gain that much more weight. He's at 168 pounds right now overall, and that's not even at his rehydrated weight. And Canelo Alvarez, that pretty much is going to be his limit. So if he is going to face someone overall at 175, it probably would benefit him, in my opinion, to not gain that much more muscle mass because certain guys overall just cannot take it. It takes too much away from their stamina. And Canelo Alvarez already has, certain stamina issues already. So at the end of the day, Canelo needs to make sure that his stamina is on par. His defense needs to be very good. And he needs to make Dimitri Bivol very uncomfortable in that fight the whole entire time. He's going to have to pressure him at least 8 to 9 rounds out of the whole entire fight.
Counters. He can't outbox Bivol, so the only chance he has is...
Well, I don't necessarily agree that he can't outbox Bivol, but we all know that Dante's Boxing Nation, that he has multiple axes to grind with Canelo Alvarez, so he's not really a logical commentator. But what I will state is this. Canelo overall, once again, is going to have the performance of his life against Dimitri Bivol. He's going to have to improve on a certain amount of things. And Dimitri Bivol is going to have to maybe change his strategy around a little bit as well. Because once again, certain fighters that go into a rematch and have the exact same strategy, even if it did look like they won the first fight, they don't often fare that well. Take a look at Gennady Golovkin against Canelo Alvarez in the rematch. Take a look at Sergey Kovalev against Andre Ward in the rematch. Take a look at Marcos Maidana in the Floyd Mayweather Jr. rematch, even though maybe he was a bit more conservative in that fight, and take a look at a certain amount of the other fighters. Both fighters have to make slight improvements.
Puncher's chance. And those are slim chances against a fighter like Bivol because he's a very good defensive fighter. So Canelo Alvarez is in a really, really tough spot right now because the three options that makes the most sense for Canelo Alvarez is Bivol, David Benavidez, and Jamal Charlo. And I don't believe Canelo Alvarez wins any of those fights.
I don't think even you believe the bullshit that you're stating, Dante. Because if you truly believe that, the way that he talks about it, he acts like as if Jamal Charlo and David Benavidez would completely outbox Canelo Alvarez. But every time that Jamal Charlo and Canelo Alvarez is almost set up, the man literally changes his tune 2 minutes after overall the news is announced. Like, come on. And if you've overall been around my channel long enough, you know overall what I'm talking about. Because Dante and all these channels like Ego and, all these guys that I tend to review, when that fight all of a sudden was about to be announced, at least it was rumored, what did they say? Oh, well, Jamal Charlo didn't look the same in his last fight. So if he beats Jamal Charlo, he's beating the weaker version of Jamal Charlo. Does that sound like someone that truly believes that Jamal Charlo is going to beat Canelo? And if you truly believe that, then that's up to you. Do I think that Dante truly believes that? No, I don't. In terms of David Benavidez, in my view, would have more of a chance than what Jamal Charlo would, just because of his pure size. But in my view, he's just too defensively irresponsible. And he does have decent power. Canelo would have to take that fight very seriously. Of course, when you're a championship level caliber fighter like Canelo or anyone else, you have to take every fight seriously. But David Benavidez would be a decent threat. I just don't think that he's defensively responsible enough. And I think that if Canelo shows up in good shape, and I think all in all that if he's technically sound, I think that Canelo more than likely would probably win the fight.
It's going to be very difficult for Canelo to try to cherry pick right now because the networks like DAZN, they don't want to pay Canelo Alvarez $30 to $40 million to fight against an unknown or against an opponent that has no chance at all. Not to mention, if this fight, this Golovkin pay-per-view fight, if it doesn't do at least 1 million pay-per-view buys, which I don't believe it'll come anywhere close.
Well, come on. We all know it's not going to do 1 million pay-per-view buys. But anyway.
1 million pay-per-view buys. That means the zone is going to be way upside down. They're going to lose a lot of money in this fight that they put together.
Well, I would have to look on that. I'm not necessarily sure. But what we do know is that Dante's Boxing Nation and Boxing Ego, they're rooting against the zone because they want PBC to be supreme. And I get it to a degree. Because Eddie Hearn, from what I heard, was, going off at the mouth about how pay-per-view was dead and all this other shit. And, how the PBC, they were going to go out of business. At least that's what I heard that he said, and I wouldn't be surprised. Eddie Hearn, just like any other promoter, has a mouth on him. But at the moment, I think that DAZN is doing decently well. But Canelo Alvarez, when we talk about the future opponents, really the only other opponent that I see there that could be a great fight for Canelo Alvarez is still Dimitri Bivol. Gilberto Soto Ramirez could be a great fight as well, but Canelo has stated that at the current moment in time that I don't think that he's very interested in that fight. I think that they're both very decent friends. But we'll see overall what ends up happening. Canelo may have to take that fight.
Which is why I don't believe DAZN once again is going to pay Canelo Alvarez some crazy money to fight another Yildirim, Caleb Smith, or even a Caleb Plant. But to me, DAZN, they made it very clear that they, as a network, they actually want Canelo to fight against Bivol because Bivol is really the only other DAZN fighter they have to match Canelo Alvarez up against. And if Canelo decides to go with PBC, they're going to force Canelo to either fight David Benavidez, Charlo, Errol Spence, or all of them. So at the end of the day, Canelo
I don't think I don't know that I would be too interested in a Canelo versus Errol Spence fight. I just think that Errol Spence Jr. is way too little for Canelo Alvarez. He is an extraordinary fighter, but when you have two fighters in the ring that are very similarly skilled with each other, usually the guy that is 20 pounds heavier is probably going to win that fight. And Canelo, in my opinion, would just be too big, too skilled and too big.
Alvarez announcing who his next opponent is going to be is actually more dramatic than his last fight against Gennady Golovkin this past weekend. That's all I got for now, guys. I'm on to the next one. All right, now check this out.
But anyways, that's really about it from Dante's Boxing Nation. Now the big question will be, who is Canelo Alvarez's next opponent? If I had to guess, more than likely is going to be a rematch with Mr. Dimitri Bivol, and I would love to see that fight. Personally, the fight that I would actually rather see is probably the Jermall Charlo fight, just to see if Jermall Charlo would really even stand a chance against Canelo Alvarez, and that's a fight that I personally have wanted to see probably for the past few years. But I think that Canelo Alvarez pretty much looks at that fight as a last resort fight. And what I mean by that is that I think that Canelo Alvarez always looks at Jermall Charlo. It's basically overall like that one girl, all in all, that takes a look at that one dude that she keeps somewhat enticing, but she would never date as long as she has other options. I think that's exactly overall what Canelo Alvarez takes a look at Jermall Charlo is. He's that side dude. That's overall what Jermall Charlo is. You know, he's not the main guy when it comes down to it, but he might be another option if, you know, he has no other options. And I think overall that's what Canelo Alvarez is looking at it as. Because I think he takes a look at it and says, well, if my run is not successful at 175, then I can always have Jermall Charlo and David Benavidez because those are going to be big money fights. And I could potentially have a decent run back at 168 pounds. So I think that's how he, you know, takes a look at it as, or at least that's the way that I take a look at it. But who knows? You know, I'm not in Canelo Alvarez's mind. Who knows? But it is going to be very interesting to see, you know, who he ends up fighting next. It's going to be very particularly interesting. I would love to see the Dimitri Bivol fight, and that would be a great overall barometer of where Canelo Alvarez actually is in terms amongst the all-time greats. In my view, he already is an all-time great fighter. But if Canelo was able to beat Dimitri Bivol in a rematch, that would really state not only how decently, you know, skilled as a fighter that he is, but it also would state all in all how mentally tough he would be as a fighter. Because it is not easy to lose a fight 8 rounds to 4 and then come back in the rematch and beat that fighter that you personally probably thought that you lost to as well. So it would be very interesting. But anyways, that's really about it for today. Thanks so much for watching. I'll talk to you all later.